The coastal fog, thick and metallic, rolled in across the Pacific, a chilling spectral presence reaching the jagged edge of California. At Naval Air Station Alameda, the air thrummed with the desperate energy of a nation at war. It was the 15th of October, 1944. Lieutenant Commander James Robert Sullivan, just 28, cinched the strap of his worn leather jacket against the early morning bite. He was a veteran in the truest sense, having logged 47 combat sorties across the vast Pacific arena. His gaze, a sharp, determined steel blue, had earned him 2 distinguished flying crosses and the absolute loyalty of his men. The 4th year of the war meant every single takeoff carried the collective burden of American destiny. His aircraft, the formidable Grumman F-6F Hellcat, identified as Navy number 77,492, sat pristine under the intense hangar lights. Though the hour was barely dawn, the maintenance crews had been relentless, preparing the fighter for what paperwork claimed was a routine reconnaissance flight along the Northern California littoral. Yet in the shadow of war, the word routine was always a lie. The mission briefing had been unnervingly brief, delivered by an intelligence officer whose severe demeanor and complex insignia suggested ties well beyond standard Navy command. The mission was deceptively simple: fly northwest along the shore toward Point Reyes, then veer inland following an exacting, pre-plotted course over the Russian River Valley. He was ordered to maintain absolute radio silence, check in only at designated markers, photograph any perceived anomalies on the ground, and be back at the base within a strict 4-hour window. The assignment's most striking oddity was the insistence on total operational secrecy and the presence of 2 quiet men, dressed conspicuously in civilian business suits, who watched the briefing without uttering a word. Sullivan, ever the diligent pilot, had queried the mission's security classification, noting that the documents hinted at affiliations outside conventional naval intelligence. Captain William Hartley, his squadron commander, a hardened, grizzled pilot, had been noticeably agitated during their private pre-flight chat. Hartley had emphasized almost obsessively the paramount importance of strict adherence to the prescribed route and an absolute zero tolerance for deviation. When Sullivan pressed for clarification regarding potential threats or the specific focus of the reconnaissance, Hartley's reply was clipped and sharp: "Follow your orders, maintain radio discipline, and ask no more questions." The Hellcat's powerful engine ignited with mechanical fury, its 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney radial plant unleashing over 2,000 horsepower. Sullivan ran his pre-flight routine with ingrained efficiency, checking flight controls, verifying instrument readings, and confirming radio function. The plane was fitted with external tanks, giving it a range far exceeding the 4 hours dictated by the flight plan. Despite the normal readings, a palpable, unsettling anxiety settled over Sullivan, mirroring the density of the coastal fog itself. Tower clearance arrived at precisely 6:30 hours. As Sullivan taxied toward the runway, the eastern horizon was barely bruised with the first weak light of dawn. The air traffic controller's voice in his headset delivered the routine departure instructions, but even in the familiar cadence, Sullivan discerned a tight undercurrent that amplified his own apprehension. Advancing the throttle, the Hellcat surged, launching him skyward into what would become one of the most persistent enigmas in aviation history. The climb was flawless. As directed, Sullivan banked hard to the northwest, following the sinuous California coastline. Below, the landscape was a stark ribbon dividing the deep Pacific from the nascent light illuminating the ranches and forests. His route took him past familiar San Francisco landmarks, over a fog-kissed Golden Gate Bridge, and along the rugged Marin County cliffs. Radio chatter was minimal, confined strictly to the mandatory position checks. At 7:15 hours, he transmitted the first required report. Passing Point Reyes, maintaining assigned altitude of 8,000 feet, no unusual observations to report. The second checkpoint followed 30 minutes later as he turned inland, heading deep into the Russian River Valley, a deviation that seemed to defy any logical military reconnaissance purpose. His voice, logged by the ground operators, remained utterly calm. Base control, Navy 77492, passing checkpoint 2, continuing mission as briefed, weather clear, visibility unlimited. These would be the final words ever received from Lieutenant Commander James Robert Sullivan. What transpired in the subsequent 1 hour and 17 minutes remains an unbroken mystery, surviving across 8 decades. Sullivan failed to report in at checkpoint 3 at the scheduled time of 8:30 hours. After 15 minutes of complete radio silence, base control initiated urgent repeated attempts to contact the pilot. All calls were met only by static. By 900 hours, a massive search and rescue operation had been launched, deploying multiple aircraft, Coast Guard cutters, and ground teams to scour the rough coastal terrain and inland valleys where Sullivan might have gone down. The frantic search effort continued unabated for a full 2 weeks, spanning thousands of square miles of open ocean, dense forest, and rugged mountain topography. Military investigators conducted exhaustive interviews with anyone who reported witnessing aircraft activity that fateful morning. Radar facilities confirmed tracking Sullivan's Hellcat until approximately 7:55 hours, at which point the plane's signal simply disappeared from their monitors over the mountainous area east of the Russian River. The loss of contact occurred in a region notorious for unreliable radar coverage due to the challenging terrain. This geographical factor made it impossible to definitively determine the cause of the signal's vanishing. It could have been equipment malfunction, terrain masking, or the physical destruction of the aircraft. No distress calls were ever received, no emergency beacons were activated, and despite the most comprehensive search operation mounted by the Pacific Fleet since the war began, no wreckage was ever discovered. Coast Guard vessels ceaselessly patrolled the offshore waters while Army Air Force search planes systematically covered every grid square of the massive inland zone. Ground teams, comprising military personnel, civilian volunteers, and local law enforcement, painstakingly combed through tangled forests, dangerously steep ravines, and remote, isolated valleys where a plane could have crashed without any immediate visual sign from the air. The official incident report, classified at the highest security level and permanently sealed within Navy archives, concluded tersely that Lieutenant Commander Sullivan and his aircraft were presumed lost due to unknown causes. The extreme classification meant that even Sullivan's next of kin were given only the barest, most sterilized information. Their son and husband had died while serving his country during a routine training flight along the California coast. There was zero mention of the actual reconnaissance mission, the mysterious intelligence observers, or the highly unusual circumstances surrounding his disappearance. James Robert Sullivan's journey began far from the coastal fog and wartime secrecy, in the small agricultural community of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He was born on March 22, 1916, to Patrick and Margaret Sullivan. Patrick ran a successful grain elevator that supported the surrounding farming region, and Margaret taught grade school in the local one-room schoolhouse. As the youngest of four siblings, James quickly developed an intense fascination with mechanical contraptions, and crucially with flying machines, an obsession that would ultimately define his path and tragically intersect with some of the most guarded military operations of World War II. Growing up through the 1920s and early 30s, young James was captivated by the itinerant barnstorming pilots who occasionally brought their aerial stunts to rural Iowa, offering rides to any brave soul willing to clamber aboard their fabric-covered biplanes. His parents initially dismissed this interest as a fleeting childhood fancy, but James's passion for aviation only deepened with age. He spent countless hours engrossed in aviation journals, meticulously crafting highly detailed model airplanes and nurturing dreams of climbing high into the clouds like his legendary heroes Charles Lindbergh and Jimmy Doolittle. Academic success came effortlessly to James. He consistently ranked among the top students in his graduating class, managing this achievement despite splitting his time between studies and his mechanical hobbies. His aptitude for mathematics and physics particularly impressed his instructors, who recognized the analytical mind that would later prove indispensable in the rigorous demands of military flight. James's mechanical gifts were equally pronounced, evidenced by his natural ability to repair farm machinery, automobiles, and virtually any mechanical device brought to the Sullivan residence by neighbors. These skills secured him a coveted part-time job at the local Ford dealership while he was still in high school, where he absorbed advanced technical methods and honed the troubleshooting instincts that would later be vital in the cockpit. His high school years were marked by deep involvement in aviation-related activities. He co-founded the school's fledgling aviation club, where students designed and flew model aircraft while learning the foundational principles of navigation and flight. James emerged as a natural leader within the club, organizing aerial competitions and teaching younger students the complexities of aerodynamics. Recognizing his profound potential, his teachers strongly encouraged him to pursue higher education. This guidance led to his acceptance at Iowa State University with a full academic scholarship, allowing him to pursue his ambitions without placing a financial strain on his family. At Iowa State, James chose mechanical engineering as his major and eagerly participated in the university's emerging civilian aviation program. This initiative, established in cooperation with the Civil Aeronautics Administration, provided students with critical theoretical knowledge alongside practical flying experience, skills that were rapidly gaining national importance as the country prepared for potential conflicts. James excelled in every facet of the program. He earned his private pilot's license during his sophomore year and had logged over 100 flight hours by the time he graduated. His flying instructors consistently praised his innate ability, describing him as intuitive, precise, and exceptionally calm under pressure. The university years also served to refine his leadership abilities and broaden his perspective beyond the confines of rural Iowa. He served as president of the Engineering Society, organized community volunteer efforts, and maintained stellar academic performance while juggling part-time employment to supplement his scholarship funding. Fellow students recalled him as serious but approachable, possessing a dry sense of humor and an unyielding commitment to nurturing the success of his peers. These innate qualities would later distinguish him as an exceptionally effective military leader, securing the profound respect of every man who flew under his command. The devastating attack on Pearl Harbor struck during James's senior year, violently reshaping his future, along with that of millions of other young Americans. Abandoning his original ambition of pursuing a civilian engineering career, he immediately applied for Navy flight training. This decision was driven by both a powerful sense of patriotic duty and an intense, burning desire to serve as a combat pilot in what promised to be the largest, most critical conflict in human history. His stellar academic record, extensive pre-war flight experience, and proven leadership potential made him a perfect fit for the Navy's rapidly expanding, accelerated pilot training program designed to meet the demands of global warfare. Naval flight training commenced at Pensacola Naval Air Station in February 1942. James joined hundreds of determined young men from across the nation, all united by the common goal of serving as naval aviators. The program was notoriously intense and deeply challenging, structured to forge civilians into combat-ready pilots in the shortest possible time while rigorously upholding the Navy's pre-war standards of excellence. James thrived in this high-pressure environment, demonstrating exceptional mastery in handling various aircraft, navigation, aerial gunnery, and formation flying, all indicators that he was destined for combat leadership. The training schedule was both physically and mentally grueling, with days beginning well before dawn and often stretching late into the evening. Students transitioned through multiple aircraft types, from basic trainers to advanced fighters, while simultaneously mastering the complex procedures vital for carrier operations and high-stakes combat flying. James's engineering background provided him with a clear advantage in quickly understanding aircraft systems and performance characteristics, while his natural flying intuition ensured he excelled in all hands-on phases of pilot instruction. His instructors frequently praised his capacity to remain focused and analytical, even during the most demanding simulation and training scenarios, qualities that would prove priceless in the life or death situations awaiting him in combat. Upon graduating from flight training with top honors, Ensign James Sullivan was assigned to Fighting Squadron 32, VF-32, which was newly equipped with the formidable Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter, the aircraft destined to become the cornerstone of Navy fighter operations across the Pacific theater. The squadron deployed to the Pacific in June 1943, initially operating from the carrier USS Yorktown before transitioning to land-based operations in the Marshall Islands as American forces began their relentless, inexorable drive toward the Japanese mainland. Sullivan's initial combat missions involved escorting large bombing raids targeting Japanese-held atolls. Here he swiftly proved himself as a highly skilled and profoundly dependable pilot, one who could be trusted to complete any mission assigned, regardless of the inherent dangers. His combat record was flawless from the start. During the intense Battle of the Philippine Sea, Sullivan expertly shot down 3 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement, showcasing the tactical acumen and aggressive aerial spirit that earned him his first Distinguished Flying Cross. His squadron mates respected his tactical decisions and relied heavily on his steady leadership during the chaotic, rapidly evolving aerial battles that were characteristic of the Pacific conflict. Sullivan possessed an intuitive grasp of aerial combat strategy and a remarkable ability to maintain composure under heavy fire, characteristics that facilitated his rapid ascent through the ranks to become an effective flight leader. The promotion to lieutenant came quickly, a direct acknowledgement of both his superior flying skills and his natural gift for leading other pilots in combat scenarios where split-second decisions were the definitive line between life and death. His flight leaders consistently lauded his combat performance, specifically noting his proficiency at maintaining formation integrity while actively engaging the enemy and his dedication to protecting less experienced pilots during their first taste of combat. These exceptional leadership qualities, coupled with his deep technical expertise and proven combat effectiveness, cemented his status as a rising star in naval aviation, destined for increased responsibility and more critical assignments. Between grueling combat deployments, Sullivan often returned to California for advanced training and aircraft familiarization programs, necessary steps to keep pace with the hyper-accelerated technological progress happening throughout the war. It was during one of these brief periods that he met and married Catherine Elizabeth Morrison, a Navy nurse stationed at Oakland Naval Hospital. Catherine shared James's unwavering dedication to the national war effort. Their courtship was swift but passionate, unfolding against the backdrop of pervasive wartime uncertainty that drastically compressed normal relationship timelines, making every shared moment profoundly precious and meaningful. They married on September 8, 1943, in a quiet, simple ceremony attended only by squadron members and hospital staff who had become their surrogate family during the war's anxious times. Catherine later described her husband as profoundly thoughtful, intensely dedicated, and quietly confident, noting that his gentle demeanor stood in sharp contrast to the aggressive skill set he utilized as a fighter pilot. He rarely spoke about his harrowing combat experiences, preferring instead to focus intensely on their shared plans for life after the war and the family they passionately hoped to start once global peace was restored. They often discussed returning to Iowa, where James planned to leverage his accumulated military skills to establish an aircraft maintenance business, while Catherine intended to resume her nursing career as they built their civilian life lives together. The couple's shared time was inherently restricted by the relentless demands of the war and the military assignments that kept them physically separated for months on end. James's second major deployment took him back into the heat of the Pacific theater, this time for operations in the Mariana Islands, where he was heavily involved in the invasion of Saipan and the subsequent grueling campaigns that steadily pushed American forces closer to the Japanese home islands. His second Distinguished Flying Cross was awarded for a mission protecting severely damaged bombers struggling back from raids on Japanese strongholds. Despite facing superior numbers and dangerously low fuel levels, Sullivan aggressively engaged enemy fighters threatening the vulnerable bomber formation. He succeeded in shooting down 2 additional enemy aircraft, ensuring that all the bombers and their crews reached safety intact. By the late summer of 1944, Sullivan had completed his mandated combat tour and received reassignment orders to Naval Air Station Alameda, NAS Alameda, for what was intended to be a welcome period of rest and training duty. This posting was viewed as a well-earned reward for his distinguished service, providing an opportunity to remain stateside, contribute to pilot training programs, and share his invaluable combat experience with newly qualified aviators preparing for their own Pacific deployments. Catherine joined him in California, and they secured a small apartment in Oakland. After months of separation and the crushing stress of constant combat operations, they were finally able to enjoy a semblance of normal married life. The predictable routine of training and administrative duties at Alameda seemed perfectly suited to helping Sullivan decompress from the intense combat stress and perpetual danger. Fellow officers noted that he appeared relaxed and genuinely optimistic about the eventual conclusion of the war, possessing the quiet confidence of a man who had proved his mettle under fire and earned the right to look ahead to peacetime. He wrote regular, cheerful letters to his family back in Iowa, describing California's pleasant climate and expressing his confidence that he would soon complete his military obligations and return home to finally start the civilian life he had reluctantly postponed. His final letter, which his parents received just 3 days before his disappearance, spoke enthusiastically about civilian flying prospects and his concrete plans to pursue a commercial pilot's license, allowing him to remain in aviation while establishing a family business. Catherine's memories of their last evening together would cling to her for the remainder of her life, growing increasingly precious as the mystery of her husband's fate remained stubbornly unsolved over the years. They had a quiet dinner at a small Oakland restaurant, finalizing plans for a much-delayed honeymoon trip to San Francisco once James completed his current assignment and could take extended leave. He seemed unusually introspective that evening, mentioning that he had been selected for a special mission, but offering no details concerning its nature or expected duration. When Catherine pressed gently for more information, James simply explained that the mission was classified but appeared routine, involving coastal reconnaissance work that would only keep him away for a few hours and should present no unusual dangers. The morning of October 15th unfolded like any other during their brief, comfortable time together in California, marked by the predictable rhythms of military life and the domestic tranquility they had finally managed to build. James rose early for his pre-flight briefing, kissing Catherine goodbye just as she prepared for her own nursing shift at the hospital, where her skills were desperately needed to treat wounded servicemen arriving from Pacific operations. His final words to her were typically hopeful and loving. "I'll see you tonight and we can finish planning that San Francisco trip." She never saw him again, and those final, optimistic words would echo in her memory for the rest of her life. The day Lieutenant Commander Sullivan vanished began in the pre-dawn darkness of NAS Alameda, where unusual activity had been consistently noted by base personnel throughout the preceding week. Ground crews reported seeing unfamiliar aircraft on the flight line, civilian vehicles bearing government license plates in highly restricted areas, and a significant increase in the security presence that seemed disproportionate to normal training activities. The atmosphere felt tense, charged with the kind of secretive urgency that typically signaled major combat operations or highly classified missions that extended far beyond routine military scope. At 400 hours, Sullivan received an unexpected notification ordering him to report for an immediate briefing regarding his morning mission. This timing was highly unusual. Standard reconnaissance flights were typically briefed the previous evening to ensure pilots had adequate rest and preparation time. The notification arrived through irregular channels, delivered by a petty officer who claimed to be acting on direct orders from Squadron Command, but could provide zero additional information about the assignment's urgency or nature. This unusual procedure was the first clear indication that this assignment would be radically different from the routine training flights that had occupied Sullivan's time since his return stateside. The briefing room itself was unlike anything Sullivan had encountered at Alameda. It was situated in a windowless basement area of the intelligence building, a space he had never accessed before. The room was sparsely furnished with only basic military furniture, creating an atmosphere of intense secrecy far more appropriate for top-tier classified operations than simple coastal reconnaissance. Present were his squadron commander, Captain Hartley, two completely unrecognizable intelligence officers, and the two civilian-dressed men whose silent presence had added an unsettling air of mystery to the proceedings. No one was formally introduced beyond their rank or title, and no explanation was provided for the unusual security measures that surrounded this supposedly routine mission. The intelligence briefing itself was remarkably sparse for such an apparently high-priority assignment, completely lacking the detailed operational information that typically accompanied complex reconnaissance flights. Sullivan was instructed to adhere strictly to a specific route, fly northwest from Alameda, pass Point Reyes before turning inland toward the Russian River Valley, maintaining precise altitude and timing while photographing any ground activity that appeared unusual or out of place. The camera equipment provided was far more sophisticated than standard reconnaissance gear, featuring telephoto lenses and specialized film. This suggested the mission's importance extended well beyond routine coastal surveillance, indicating targets that required exceptional image quality. What struck Sullivan as particularly odd were the specific geographical coordinates he was ordered to investigate. Rather than covering a broad coastal area, as expected for general reconnaissance, his assigned route focused on a narrow corridor inland from Point Reyes, following river valleys and mountainous terrain that seemed strategically unimportant. The coordinates pinpointed an area of dense forest and steep topography that was sparsely inhabited and offered no apparent military significance. When Sullivan questioned the rationale for concentrating on this particular region, he was curtly informed that operational details were classified above his clearance level, and that his job was to follow orders without seeking unnecessary explanations. The radio communication protocol was equally unusual and unlike anything Sullivan had encountered during his extensive combat experience. Instead of maintaining regular contact with base control, Sullivan was instructed to transmit position reports only at 3 predetermined checkpoints using coded identification numbers rather than standard call signs. Between these checkpoint reports, he was to maintain complete radio silence, regardless of what he might observe or encounter. Emergency communication procedures were modified to require specific authorization codes that Sullivan had never previously used, adding another layer of complexity to the ostensibly straightforward reconnaissance mission. Equipment inspection revealed several anomalies that troubled Sullivan, but which he was not permitted to question despite his vast experience with aircraft modifications and specialized gear. His Hellcat carried additional fuel tanks that extended its range far beyond what the prescribed mission route would require, suggesting either that the true mission parameters were different from what he had been told, or that undisclosed contingencies existed. The aircraft's standard armament load was reduced to accommodate specialized camera equipment and what appeared to be electronic monitoring devices whose purpose was not explained, and whose operation he was specifically instructed not to investigate. Most concerning was the installation of a transponder system that Sullivan did not recognize, connected to controls that he was specifically instructed not to touch under any circumstances. The equipment appeared to be far more sophisticated than standard navigation aids, with multiple antennas and electronic components suggesting capabilities beyond simple position reporting. When Sullivan inquired about the equipment's purpose, he was told that it was classified electronic gear that would function automatically and required no pilot input. The explanation was unsatisfactory, but attempts to obtain additional information were firmly rebuffed by the intelligence officers present at the briefing. Pre-flight preparation proceeded under unusually tight security, with armed guards restricting access to Sullivan's aircraft and prohibiting normal interaction between ground crews and the pilot. Mechanics who serviced the Hellcat were required to sign additional security agreements and were immediately escorted from the area upon completing their tasks. This level of operational security was typically reserved for missions involving highly classified technology or strategic targets, neither of which seemed relevant to coastal reconnaissance. The ground crew chief, a veteran mechanic with 20 years of Navy service, later reported that the modifications to Sullivan's aircraft were unlike anything he had encountered during his extensive career. The additional equipment required significant electrical modifications and structural changes that suggested the aircraft was being prepared for purposes far beyond standard reconnaissance work. However, when the chief attempted to discuss the modifications with his superiors, he was ordered to complete the work without questions and to maintain absolute silence on the matter. Whether conditions on the morning of October 15th were ideal for flying, with clear skies, unlimited visibility, and minimal wind. The Pacific high-pressure system had stabilized over the region, creating the kind of perfect flying weather that pilots dream about. These excellent conditions would make Sullivan's subsequent disappearance even more puzzling, as there were no environmental factors that could explain mechanical failure, spatial disorientation, or the navigational difficulties that sometimes led to aircraft losses. The coastal fog that typically plagued the region had lifted early, providing clear visibility from the surface to well above Sullivan's assigned altitude. Winds were light and variable, creating smooth flying conditions that would allow precise navigation and high-quality photography. Weather stations throughout Northern California reported similar conditions, with no adverse weather phenomena anywhere along Sullivan's planned route. The meteorological conditions were so favorable that weather-related aircraft loss could be ruled out as a factor in Sullivan's disappearance. Takeoff occurred precisely on schedule at 6:30 hours, with Sullivan's Hellcat lifting off from Alameda's main runway and turning northwest toward the assigned operational area. Tower controllers tracked the aircraft's initial progress using standard radar equipment, noting normal airspeed, altitude, and heading as Sullivan followed the prescribed route along the California coastline. Radio communication functioned properly during the early phases of flight, with clear transmission quality and appropriate responses to ground control instructions. Everything appeared routine during the first phase of the mission. The flight path took Sullivan over familiar territory that he had covered during previous training flights, passing over San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate Bridge before following the Marin County coastline toward Point Reyes. The route was well within the operating area normally used for training flights, making navigation simple and eliminating any possibility of confusion about geographical landmarks or navigational references. Sullivan's experience with the area and the excellent weather conditions should have made this portion of the flight completely routine. Ground observers along the coast reported seeing a single military aircraft flying northwest at the approximate time of Sullivan's passage, confirming that his mission proceeded normally through the initial phase. A lighthouse keeper at Point Reyes noted the distinctive sound of a single-engine fighter aircraft passing overhead at what he estimated to be medium altitude, consistent with Sullivan's assigned flight parameters. These observations confirmed that Sullivan had successfully reached his first checkpoint and was continuing the mission as briefed. The first checkpoint report arrived exactly on time at 7:15 hours, confirming Sullivan's position over Point Reyes and his continued progress toward the operational area. His voice transmission was recorded by base radio operators and later analyzed extensively by investigators searching for any indication of problems or unusual circumstances. The recording revealed no signs of stress, mechanical difficulty, or concern about the mission parameters. Sullivan's tone was professional and calm, consistent with routine mission operations and showing no awareness of any developing problems. The turn inland toward the Russian River Valley marked the beginning of the portion of Sullivan's flight that would lead to his mysterious disappearance. This phase of the mission took him away from the coastal areas where ground observers might witness any unusual occurrences and into the mountainous terrain where radar coverage was sporadic and radio communication could be affected by topographical interference. The route followed river valleys and mountain ridges that were sparsely populated and seldom traversed by aircraft, creating conditions where unusual events might occur without witnesses. Ground observers in the Russian River Valley area reported hearing aircraft engines during the appropriate time period, but the mountainous terrain and dense forest cover made visual confirmation difficult. A forest ranger stationed near Journeyville reported the sound of a single-engine aircraft flying inland from the coast, following the river valley toward the mountainous interior. The timing of this observation corresponded with Sullivan's planned route, confirming that his mission continued to proceed normally through the second phase of his flight. The second checkpoint report transmitted at 7:45 hours would be the last confirmed communication from Sullivan's aircraft. Base radio logs recorded his position as being over the designated coordinates inland from the coast, maintaining assigned altitude and continuing the mission as briefed. Signal strength was strong and clear, with no indication of equipment problems or environmental interference that might affect communication or navigation systems. Sullivan's voice remained calm and professional, showing no signs of distress or concern about his situation. What happened during the 33 minutes following that final radio transmission became the central mystery of the entire incident. Radar contact with Sullivan's aircraft was lost at approximately 8:18 hours when his transponder signal simply vanished from ground control displays. The loss of radar contact occurred over mountainous terrain where signal interference was common, initially causing no immediate alarm among radar operators, who assumed the aircraft would reappear as it cleared the terrain and return to areas with better radar coverage. The mountainous terrain east of the Russian River Valley was known for creating radar shadows and communication dead zones that could temporarily isolate aircraft from ground control. Pilots flying in the area were accustomed to brief periods without radio contact, and radar operators were familiar with aircraft signals disappearing and reappearing as aircraft maneuvered through the complex topography. The initial loss of contact with Sullivan's aircraft was therefore treated as routine, with no immediate concern about his safety or mission status. When Sullivan failed to transmit his third checkpoint report at 8:30 hours, base control attempted to establish radio contact using standard communication procedures. The initial calls were routine, as missed checkpoint reports sometimes occurred due to radio problems, pilot distraction, or minor navigational difficulties that caused timing discrepancies. However, when these calls went unanswered despite clear atmospheric conditions and proper equipment function on the ground, concern began to grow among control tower personnel, who recognized that something unusual was occurring. 15 minutes of unsuccessful radio contact attempts triggered emergency protocols established for missing aircraft incidents. The procedures called for expanding communication attempts to include all available radio frequencies and emergency channels, while simultaneously alerting search and rescue organizations about the potential aircraft emergency. Base commanders were notified of the situation, and preliminary search plans were activated to prepare for immediate deployment of rescue assets if the aircraft could not be located through continued radio contact attempts. The massive search effort that followed Sullivan's disappearance represented one of the most intensive aircraft search operations ever conducted by Pacific Fleet forces during the Second World War. Within 2 hours of the missed radio contact, search aircraft from multiple bases were systematically combing the suspected crash area, while Coast Guard vessels began patrolling the coastal waters where Sullivan might have gone down if he had attempted to return to base and crashed in the ocean. Ground teams composed of military personnel and civilian volunteers started searching the rugged terrain of Mendocino and Sonoma counties, focusing on areas where aircraft wreckage might be concealed by dense forest canopy or steep terrain. Search operations continued around the clock for 14 days, expanding to cover thousands of square miles of ocean, forest, and mountainous terrain that might contain evidence of Sullivan's fate. Military investigators interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses, analyzed every piece of radar data, and examined weather records for any factor that might explain Sullivan's disappearance. Despite the exhaustive effort and the most advanced search techniques available in 1944, no trace of the missing pilot or his aircraft was ever discovered, creating a mystery that would persist for 8 decades. The official investigation into Lieutenant Commander Sullivan's disappearance was conducted under extraordinary security measures that far exceeded normal procedures for missing aircraft incidents. Led by a joint team of Navy investigators and civilian intelligence officers whose credentials extended far beyond normal military channels, the investigation was classified at levels typically reserved for the most sensitive wartime secrets. Personnel involved in the investigation were required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements that prohibited them from discussing any aspect of the case with unauthorized persons, and all findings were sealed in classified archives that would remain inaccessible for decades. Investigation team members were selected based on their security clearances and prior experience with sensitive military matters rather than their expertise in aircraft accident investigation. This unusual staffing decision suggested that the investigation's primary concern was protecting classified information rather than determining the actual cause of Sullivan's disappearance. Traditional accident investigators were excluded from the process despite their superior qualifications for analyzing aircraft incidents, indicating that the case involved factors beyond normal aviation safety concerns. The investigators' first priority was interviewing every person who had any contact with Sullivan or knowledge of his final mission. But the questioning focused more on maintaining secrecy than gathering factual information about the circumstances of his disappearance. Base personnel, including ground crews, mechanics, radio operators, and intelligence officers, were subjected to intensive interrogation that emphasized their obligations to maintain security rather than their potential contributions to understanding what had happened to the missing pilot. Many interviewees later reported feeling that they were being treated as potential security risks rather than helpful witnesses to a tragic accident. Captain Hartley, Sullivan's squadron commander, was questioned extensively about the mission's classification and operational details. But the investigation records suggest that Hartley himself was not fully informed about the mission's true purpose or the identity of the civilian intelligence officers who had organized it. His testimony revealed frustration with the unusual command structure and his exclusion from normal mission planning processes, indicating that the operation was controlled by agencies outside the standard Navy chain of command. Hartley's responses showed that even senior military officers were kept in the dark about the true nature of Sullivan's assignment. Ground radar stations that had tracked Sullivan's flight were required to surrender all recording equipment and documentation to the investigation team immediately after the search was called off. Radar operators were questioned intensively about their observations and ordered to destroy any personal notes or records related to the incident. The radar data itself was classified and removed from normal Navy archives, making it unavailable to subsequent investigators or researchers attempting to understand the circumstances of Sullivan's disappearance. This unusual treatment of routine operational data suggested that Sullivan's flight had involved activities that required extraordinary protection. The investigation team devoted considerable effort to examining Sullivan's background, personal relationships, and potential motivations for deliberate disappearance, despite the complete absence of evidence suggesting such possibilities. This line of inquiry seemed highly inappropriate for what should have been a straightforward accident investigation, suggesting that investigators suspected Sullivan might have intentionally deviated from his mission or somehow become involved in activities that would require concealment from his own military superiors. Such suspicions were completely inconsistent with Sullivan's exemplary service record and the testimony of everyone who knew him personally. Catherine Sullivan was subjected to particularly intensive questioning about her husband's mental state, political beliefs, and any unusual behavior preceding his disappearance. Investigators seemed especially interested in determining whether Sullivan had expressed any doubts about the war effort, dissatisfaction with military service, or unusual interest in political matters that might suggest disloyalty or security risks. Catherine later described these interviews as hostile and insulting, with investigators implying that her husband might have been a traitor or deserter despite his distinguished combat record and his obvious dedication to his military duties. The personal investigation extended to Sullivan's family in Iowa, with agents interviewing his parents, siblings, and childhood friends about his character, political views, and any indication that he might have been susceptible to enemy influence or recruitment. These investigations were conducted under the pretext of routine security inquiries, but the intensity and scope of the questioning suggested that serious doubts existed about Sullivan's loyalty and motivations. Family members were bewildered by the implications and deeply hurt by suggestions that their son and brother might have been anything other than a dedicated American serviceman. Physical evidence collection was hampered by the remote location where Sullivan's aircraft had presumably crashed, and the investigation team's apparent lack of expertise in aircraft accident analysis. Search teams focused on recovering wreckage that might contain classified equipment, rather than determining the cause of the crash through systematic examination of debris patterns and impact evidence. This priority led to superficial examination of potential crash sites and inadequate analysis of the few pieces of debris that were discovered during the extensive search operation. The few pieces of metal and fabric found during the search were subjected to extensive laboratory analysis, but the results were never shared with normal accident investigation procedures or incorporated into standard safety recommendations that might prevent similar incidents. Instead, all physical evidence was classified and removed from normal investigative channels, suggesting that the debris might have revealed information about classified equipment or mission parameters that required protection. The unusual treatment of physical evidence prevented normal accident analysis procedures and contributed to the continuing mystery surrounding Sullivan's fate. Witness interviews revealed a pattern of unusual military activity in the area where Sullivan disappeared, but this information was not incorporated into the official findings or used to develop theories about what might have happened to the missing aircraft. Local residents reported seeing heavy trucks and construction equipment in remote forest areas where no legitimate projects were known to exist, while law enforcement officers recalled being instructed to avoid certain areas during the time period of Sullivan's disappearance. These reports suggested that classified activities were occurring in the region, but investigators showed no interest in pursuing these leads. The investigation's conclusions were as mysterious as the incident itself, providing no meaningful explanation for Sullivan's disappearance, while emphasizing the classified nature of his mission and the security requirements that surrounded the case. The final report, classified and sealed immediately upon completion, officially attributed Sullivan's disappearance to unknown causes during the execution of a classified reconnaissance mission, without making any determination regarding mechanical failure, pilot error, weather conditions, or other factors that might have contributed to the incident. This conclusion satisfied no one and answered none of the questions raised by the mysterious circumstances. The report's recommendations were entirely focused on improving security procedures rather than preventing similar accidents or addressing the aviation safety issues that might have been revealed by proper accident investigation. The emphasis on security over safety suggested that the investigation's real purpose was protecting classified information rather than learning from Sullivan's disappearance to improve military aviation safety. This priority prevented the case from contributing to the body of knowledge that normally results from aircraft accident investigations. Family members and squadron personnel were provided with minimal information about the investigation's findings, creating lasting resentment and suspicion about the military's handling of the case. Sullivan was declared officially dead 6 months after his disappearance, but his family was never informed about the classified nature of his final mission or the unusual circumstances surrounding the investigation. This secrecy prevented normal grieving processes and left lingering questions that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives, while creating lasting distrust of official explanations for military incidents. The investigation team's final actions demonstrated that protecting classified information was considered more important than providing closure to grieving families or contributing to aviation safety knowledge. All documentation was sealed in high-security archives with classification levels that would prevent access for decades, while investigation team members were reassigned to different bases and sworn to permanent secrecy about their involvement in the case. Personnel who had participated in the search were transferred or discharged from military service, eliminating potential sources of future information about the case and ensuring that institutional memory of the incident would be lost over time. The decades following Lieutenant Commander Sullivan's disappearance were marked by official silence, bureaucratic stonewalling, and the gradual fading of memories as those who knew him grew old and died. The Navy maintained strict classification of all documents related to his final mission, deflecting inquiries from family members, journalists, and researchers with standard responses about national security requirements and ongoing classified operations. This wall of secrecy only deepened the mystery and fueled speculation about what had really happened during those missing minutes over the mountains of Northern California. Catherine Sullivan's efforts to learn the truth about her husband's fate consumed much of her remaining life, becoming an obsession that affected her subsequent relationships and her ability to achieve closure about the tragedy. Despite remarrying in 1951 to a kind man who understood her need to continue searching for answers, and raising 3 children who grew up knowing about their stepfather's mysterious predecessor, she never stopped seeking information about James's disappearance. Her extensive correspondence with Navy officials, carefully preserved in family papers, reveals a pattern of polite responses that provided no meaningful information, while maintaining the fiction that national security considerations prevented disclosure of relevant details. In 1954, Catherine hired a private investigator named Robert Chen, a former FBI agent who specialized in military cases and had developed contacts throughout the defense establishment during his government service. Chen's investigation uncovered several intriguing leads that seemed to point toward unusual military activities in the Mendocino area during October 1944. A logging crew that had been working in the mountains reported seeing heavy trucks and earth-moving equipment in remote forest areas where no legitimate construction projects were known to exist, while workers described military personnel restricting access to certain areas without explanation. Chen's most significant discovery was a partially burned document found in a trash barrel behind an abandoned military facility near Ukiah, California, which had been used for storage and training purposes during the war years. The document fragment appeared to be part of an operations order referring to Project Redwood and containing geographical coordinates that closely matched Sullivan's assigned reconnaissance route. The document also contained references to experimental aircraft evaluation and German technology assessment, suggesting that Sullivan's mission had involved something far more complex than routine reconnaissance work. However, when Chen attempted to pursue this lead through official channels and contacted former military personnel who might have knowledge about Project Redwood, he was visited by federal agents who confiscated his files and issued clear warnings against continuing his investigation. The agents identified themselves as being from unspecified government agencies and made it clear that further inquiry into the matter would result in serious legal consequences for both Chen and his client. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Some aspects of the Second World War remained too sensitive for civilian investigation even a decade after the conflict's end. The 1960s brought new developments as a generation of investigative journalists began challenging government secrecy and questioning official narratives about wartime operations that had been accepted without scrutiny during the patriotic fervor of the war years. Several prominent reporters attempted to investigate Sullivan's disappearance as part of broader examinations of classified military programs that might have involved questionable activities or represented misuse of government resources. However, their efforts were consistently thwarted by the same wall of official silence that had frustrated earlier inquiries, with government officials citing ongoing national security concerns that prevented disclosure of information from the 1940s. Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, requests filed by journalists and researchers were routinely denied on national security grounds, with officials arguing that disclosure of information about Sullivan's mission would reveal intelligence capabilities and operational methods that remained relevant to contemporary military operations. This reasoning seemed increasingly strained as time passed, and the technology of the 1940s became obsolete, but government agencies maintained their position that certain wartime secrets would remain classified indefinitely. The persistence of this secrecy began to generate suspicion that the case involved more than routine military operations. Aviation enthusiasts and amateur historians kept interest in the case alive through articles in specialty magazines and presentations at air show gatherings, where veterans shared stories about unusual wartime experiences. These informal investigations produced numerous theories about Sullivan's fate, ranging from mechanical failure in remote terrain to involvement in secret weapons testing programs that might have been based on captured German technology. Some researchers speculated that Sullivan had been conducting surveillance related to suspected German submarine activity along the Pacific coast, while others suggested that he might have been involved in testing experimental aircraft that were too classified for normal military channels. However, none of these theories could be verified without access to classified records, which remained firmly sealed in government archives. The few researchers who possessed appropriate security clearances and attempted to access relevant documents were denied permission, suggesting that the case involved agencies or programs that extended beyond normal military operations and into areas that remained sensitive decades after the original events. The continuing classification suggested that Sullivan's mission had touched on matters that government officials considered permanently sensitive. The Cold War era brought additional complications to any investigation of wartime mysteries, as government agencies became even more secretive about historical operations that might reveal intelligence capabilities or operational methods still in use against the Soviet Union. The Sullivan case was effectively buried under layers of classification and bureaucratic protection that made meaningful research virtually impossible, even for historians and researchers with appropriate security clearances. The case became symbolic of the broader trend toward government secrecy that characterized American intelligence operations during the confrontation with communism. Family interest in the case continued through subsequent generations, with Sullivan's nephews and nieces growing up with family stories about their mysterious uncle, and occasionally attempting their own investigations as they reached adulthood. In 1978, his nephew Michael Sullivan, a lawyer specializing in government accountability issues, filed a comprehensive Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) lawsuit, demanding the release of all documents related to his uncle's disappearance. The legal battle represented the most serious challenge to the government's secrecy about the case, but it ultimately proved unsuccessful after 6 years of litigation. The lawsuit dragged through federal courts before being dismissed on national security grounds, with judges accepting government arguments that disclosure would harm ongoing intelligence operations despite the passage of more than 3 decades since the original incident. The court's reasoning reflected the broader judicial deference to executive branch claims about national security that characterized the Cold War period, but it also suggested that the Sullivan case involved genuinely sensitive matters that extended beyond routine military operations. The legal defeat effectively ended family efforts to obtain official disclosure of relevant information. The 1980s and 90s saw renewed interest in World War II mysteries, as classified documents from other wartime programs began to be declassified and released to the public under new policies designed to promote historical transparency. Researchers hoped that Sullivan's case might be included in these releases, particularly as the government began acknowledging previously secret programs involving captured German technology and experimental aircraft development. However, the documents related to Project Redwood and Sullivan's disappearance remained stubbornly classified, with officials maintaining that disclosure would continue to harm national security interests. The few references to Project Redwood that appeared in other declassified materials were so heavily redacted as to provide no useful information about the program's purpose, scope, or connection to Sullivan's disappearance. These fragmentary references confirmed that Project Redwood had existed and had involved classified military activities, but they revealed nothing about what Sullivan had been doing or why his mission had ended in mysterious circumstances. The continued redaction of references to the project suggested that it remained sensitive to contemporary government operations. Advances in computer technology and internet communication during the 1990s allowed researchers to share information more effectively and coordinate their investigations across geographical boundaries. Online forums dedicated to aviation mysteries attracted participants from around the world, some with access to international archives or family documents that shed new light on wartime operations that had been conducted in cooperation with foreign governments. However, the Sullivan case remained frustratingly opaque, with no significant new information emerging despite the efforts of dedicated researchers who pooled their resources and expertise. The international research efforts revealed that several allied nations had conducted similar programs involving captured German technology during the immediate post-war period, suggesting that Project Redwood might have been part of a broader international effort to acquire and exploit German scientific advances before they could be captured by the Soviet Union. However, foreign archives contain no references to American programs or personnel, indicating that Project Redwood had been conducted with extraordinary secrecy that prevented even Allied governments from learning about its activities. The turn of the 21st century brought hope that changing political attitudes and the passage of time might finally allow disclosure of Second World War secrets that no longer posed genuine security risks to the United States. Several high-profile cases resulted in the declassification of previously protected documents, including information about intelligence operations, experimental weapons programs, and cooperation with former enemy scientists that had been considered too sensitive for disclosure during the Cold War period. These developments encouraged Sullivan's remaining family members to renew their efforts to learn the truth about their relatives' fate. However, their renewed requests for information continued to be denied, with officials citing ongoing intelligence concerns and the need to protect sources and methods that somehow remained sensitive after more than 60 years. The reasoning seemed increasingly implausible as the participants in wartime programs died of old age and the technology of the 1940s became museum pieces. But government agencies maintained their position that certain aspects of Project Redwood required permanent protection. The persistence of this secrecy began to generate conspiracy theories about what Sullivan's mission might have involved. Technology advances during the early 2000s enabled more sophisticated analysis of the limited evidence available about Sullivan's disappearance. Digital enhancement of radar records and witness statements revealed previously unnoticed details, while satellite imagery allowed researchers to examine potential crash sites with unprecedented precision. Ground-penetrating radar and metal detection equipment became available to civilian researchers, enabling systematic searches of areas where Sullivan's aircraft might have crashed without being immediately visible from the ground or air. Despite these technological advantages and the dedication of researchers who spent thousands of hours searching remote areas of Northern California, no trace of the missing Hellcat was discovered. The negative results suggested either that the aircraft had been completely destroyed in a crash, had come down in an area that had not been searched, or had somehow been removed from the crash site by unknown parties. Each possibility raised additional questions about the circumstances of Sullivan's disappearance and the continuing government secrecy surrounding the case. Professional historians studying the Second World War period occasionally encountered tantalizing references to Sullivan's case in other classified documents, but always in heavily redacted contexts that revealed nothing useful about the circumstances of his disappearance. These fragmentary references confirmed that the case remained active in government archives and that decisions about classification were being regularly reviewed and maintained by contemporary officials. The continuing attention to a 60-year-old case suggested that it involved matters that remained relevant to current government operations. The references also indicated that Sullivan's disappearance was connected to other classified programs that had involved experimental aircraft development, German technology acquisition, and secret cooperation between military services and civilian intelligence agencies. The pattern suggested a complex web of classified activities during the final years of World War II that had remained hidden from public view and continued to require protection from disclosure. The scope of these programs appeared to be far larger than anything that had been publicly acknowledged about American wartime research and development efforts. By the early 2000s, most of the original participants in Sullivan's story had died, taking their knowledge with them to their graves and eliminating potential sources of information about the circumstances of his disappearance. Catherine Sullivan passed away in 1998 without ever learning what had happened to her first husband, dying with unanswered questions that had haunted her for more than 5 decades. Captain Hartley died in 1985, reportedly taking significant secrets about wartime operations to his grave and refusing to discuss classified matters even with his own family members. The few surviving veterans who might have possessed relevant knowledge about Project Redwood or Sullivan's final mission were either unwilling or unable to discuss the case, citing oaths of secrecy that they considered binding for life or suffering from failing memory that made their recollections unreliable. Some veterans hinted that they possessed information about unusual wartime activities, but felt constrained by security obligations that prevented them from sharing their knowledge even decades after the events. Their reluctance to speak suggested that Project Redwood had involved genuinely sensitive matters that participants continued to consider classified. The enduring mystery of Lieutenant Commander Sullivan's disappearance had become a symbol of government secrecy, and the tension between national security requirements and the public's right to know about historical events. Academic conferences and freedom of information advocacy groups regularly cited the case as an example of excessive classification that served no legitimate contemporary security interest while preventing historical understanding and family closure. However, these protests had no practical effect on the government's determination to maintain secrecy about whatever Sullivan had been doing during his final flight over Northern California. As the 70th anniversary of Sullivan's disappearance approached in 2014, family members made one final attempt to obtain disclosure of relevant documents through a comprehensive petition that emphasized the humanitarian aspects of the case and the lack of any reasonable security justification for continuing classification after 7 decades. Their petition, supported by numerous veterans organizations and historical societies, argued that no legitimate security interest could justify continued protection of information about events that had occurred before most Americans were born. The government's response was unchanged despite the passage of time and the compelling humanitarian arguments presented by Sullivan's family. Officials maintained that national security considerations required continued protection of the information regardless of the personal cost to family members seeking closure or the historical value of the information to researchers studying wartime programs. The response suggested that Project Redwood had involved matters that government officials considered permanently sensitive, extending beyond the normal classification periods that applied to most military operations. The mystery seemed destined to remain unsolved forever, another casualty of government secrecy and the inexorable passage of time that had eliminated most sources of information about the case. Those who remembered Sullivan personally were gone. The physical evidence had long since deteriorated or been concealed beyond discovery, and official records remained locked away in high-security archives that seemed unlikely ever to be opened. The case appeared to be heading for permanent obscurity, remembered only by aviation enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists whose speculation could never substitute for documented facts about what had really happened. Yet, the story was far from over. Unknown to researchers, family members, and government officials who continued to guard the secrets of Project Redwood, Sullivan's Hellcat and the answers to 8 decades of questions were waiting to be discovered in a location that no one had ever thought to search. The revelation that would finally solve the mystery of Lieutenant Commander Sullivan's disappearance began with an unrelated project undertaken by a group of urban exploration enthusiasts from the San Francisco Bay Area who specialized in documenting abandoned military installations and forgotten historical sites. In March 2024, exactly 80 years after Sullivan's final flight, 4 friends decided to investigate reports of abandoned Cold War facilities hidden in the remote mountains of Mendocino County. Their goal was to document defensive installations that had been constructed in secret during the early Cold War period and later abandoned as strategic priorities changed and new technologies made the facilities obsolete. The group consisted of Marcus Chen, a software engineer and amateur historian who had developed expertise in researching military installations through declassified documents and satellite imagery; Sarah Rodriguez, a professional photographer specializing in abandoned places whose work had been featured in numerous exhibitions and publications; David Kim, a former Army engineer with extensive knowledge of military construction techniques and facility design. Jessica Thompson, a freelance journalist with connections to veterans organizations and experience investigating government secrecy. They had been exploring abandoned military sites throughout California for 3 years, documenting forgotten installations and researching their historical significance through careful archival work and interviews with former personnel. Their previous discoveries had included radar stations from the Nike missile program, abandoned communication facilities from the Cold War period, and training camps that had been used during World War II before being quietly decommissioned. The team's work had been featured in photography exhibitions focusing on the forgotten infrastructure of American military history. While their research had contributed to historical preservation efforts and academic studies of Cold War defensive systems, their reputation for thorough documentation and respect for historical sites had earned them cooperation from veterans groups and occasional unofficial assistance from former military personnel. Initial research for their Mendocino expedition relied on declassified Cold War documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, geological surveys that might reveal evidence of construction in remote areas, and aerial photography dating from the 1950s through the 1980s that showed changes in terrain that might indicate human activity. They were specifically searching for evidence of defensive installations that might have been built during the early Cold War period, when military planners feared Soviet attack on West Coast targets, and constructed numerous facilities designed to provide early warning and defensive capabilities against potential invasion. The remote mountains of Mendocino County seemed like logical locations for secret radar stations, communication facilities, or even missile sites that might have been constructed during the height of Cold War tensions, and later abandoned as new technologies made them obsolete. The area's rugged terrain and sparse population would have provided ideal conditions for classified military installations, while its proximity to the coast would have made it strategically valuable for monitoring potential threats from the Pacific Ocean. The team's research had identified several promising locations where aerial photography showed geometric patterns or cleared areas that suggested human construction rather than natural formations. One particularly intriguing site was located in a narrow valley approximately 30 miles inland from the coast, accessible only by logging roads that had been abandoned for decades, and were now barely passable due to landslides and overgrowth. Satellite imagery showed what appeared to be concrete structures partially concealed by forest growth, suggesting installations that had been abandoned long enough for vegetation to begin reclaiming the area. The site's remote location and the apparent age of the structures made it an ideal target. Historical research revealed that the area had been designated as restricted military land during World War II and had remained off-limits to civilian access until the 1970s, when it was quietly transferred to the Forest Service without any public explanation of its previous military use. The lengthy period of military control suggested that significant activities had occurred in the area, while the secretive transfer to civilian management indicated that the military had wanted to distance itself from whatever had taken place there. These factors made the site particularly interesting to the exploration team. Access to the target location required careful planning and specialized equipment for what promised to be a challenging hike through dense forest and steep terrain that had deterred previous visitors. The team packed essential gear, including metal detectors for locating buried structures, ground-penetrating radar (GPR) for identifying underground facilities, and professional photography equipment for documenting whatever they might find. The journey to the site required most of their first day, following animal trails and old logging roads that were barely passable after decades of neglect and natural deterioration. The terrain was steep and rugged, covered by dense redwood and Douglas fir forest that filtered sunlight into a perpetual twilight atmosphere even during midday hours. Navigation required constant reference to GPS devices and topographical maps, as traditional landmarks were obscured by the thick forest canopy and the area's complex topographical features that made visual navigation virtually impossible. Their first significant discovery was a concrete structure partially buried by decades of landslides and completely overgrown with vegetation that had made it nearly invisible from any distance. Initial examination revealed it to be a sophisticated ventilation shaft for some kind of underground facility, with metal gratings and ductwork that suggested environmental control systems far more advanced than typical military installations of the World War II era. The construction appeared to date from the 1940s based on the concrete's composition and the style of metalwork, making it older than the Cold War installations they had originally been seeking. The ventilation system's sophistication suggested that it had been designed to support long-term underground operations rather than simple storage or temporary shelter. The engineering quality was exceptional, with corrosion-resistant materials and design features that indicated considerable investment in creating a facility capable of operating under extreme conditions. The discovery was intriguing, but not unprecedented. However, ground-penetrating radar revealed that the ventilation shaft was connected to a much larger underground complex that extended deep into the mountainside in multiple directions. The radar signatures suggested multiple chambers and corridors carved from solid rock, indicating a construction project far more ambitious than typical military installations of any era. The size and complexity of the underground facility suggested it had been designed for long-term occupation by a substantial number of personnel rather than temporary wartime use, raising questions about its original purpose and the enormous resources that would have been required for its construction. Further exploration of the surface area revealed additional features that had been concealed by decades of forest growth and natural camouflage. Careful excavation exposed concrete blast doors designed to withstand tremendous explosive forces, emergency exits that had been carefully concealed but remained functional, and what appeared to be vehicle access ramps leading underground at angles that would allow large trucks or specialized equipment to enter the facility. The engineering quality was exceptional throughout, with reinforced construction that had survived 80 years of weather and seismic activity without significant structural deterioration. The facility had clearly been designed to withstand direct attack and remain operational under extreme conditions that might include conventional bombing or even nuclear attack. The blast-resistant construction and multiple redundant systems suggested that it had been intended for use during prolonged conflicts where surface facilities might be destroyed or compromised. The level of protection and the sophisticated engineering indicated that the facility had been intended to house something of extraordinary value or importance to the war effort. The breakthrough discovery came when David Kim located a partially concealed entrance that had been damaged by a fallen tree, creating a gap large enough for human access that had previously been completely sealed. The entrance led to a concrete tunnel that descended into the mountainside at a steep angle, with emergency lighting fixtures and ventilation ducts that confirmed the facility had been designed for extended underground operations by personnel who might need to remain below ground for extended periods. Armed with powerful flashlights and safety equipment, the team began their descent into what would prove to be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in modern American military history. The main tunnel extended approximately 200 feet into the mountain before opening into a vast underground chamber carved from solid rock with precision that suggested the use of advanced excavation techniques. The chamber was roughly circular, approximately 100 feet in diameter and 30 feet high, with multiple corridors branching off in different directions like spokes on a wheel. Emergency lighting systems, though no longer functional after 8 decades, were still mounted throughout the facility in configurations that suggested it had been designed for round-the-clock operations. The construction quality and attention to detail indicated a project that had consumed enormous resources and required years of secret work by skilled engineers and construction crews. Every surface showed evidence of careful planning and execution, with drainage systems, ventilation networks, and electrical conduits that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of underground construction challenges. The facility represented a level of engineering achievement that seemed far beyond anything that would have been justified by routine military requirements. As the team explored the various corridors and chambers, they began to understand the facility's true scope and the extraordinary level of self-sufficiency built into its design. They discovered sleeping quarters designed to accommodate dozens of personnel in relative comfort, a fully equipped medical facility with surgical capabilities, communications equipment rooms with sophisticated radio and telephone systems, extensive storage areas built to support long-term occupation. The facility appeared to be completely self-sufficient in every respect, with its own power generation systems, water supply and purification equipment, waste disposal systems, and food storage areas that could have supported extended operations without external assistance. Everything about the design suggested an installation created to remain operational for months or even years, far exceeding the requirements of any known military installation from the World War II period. The level of preparation suggested that the facility had been designed for use during conflicts that might isolate it from normal military supply chains. The most stunning discovery came when they entered what was clearly the facility's main operational area, an enormous underground hangar easily large enough to house multiple aircraft simultaneously. The chamber was equipped with overhead crane systems for aircraft maintenance, sophisticated ventilation systems for managing engine exhaust, and specialized lighting. The hangar's size and equipment clearly indicated that it had been designed specifically for aircraft operations rather than simple storage. In the center of this underground hangar sat a perfectly preserved Grumman F-6F Hellcat, bearing the tail number 77,492, the exact aircraft that Lieutenant Commander James Robert Sullivan had been flying on his final mission 80 years earlier. The sight was so unexpected and so perfectly preserved that the exploration team initially thought they might be experiencing some kind of hallucination or trick of the lighting. The aircraft appeared exactly as it would have looked in 1944, with paint scheme and markings that showed no signs of deterioration despite 8 decades underground. The Hellcat was completely intact, showing absolutely no signs of crash damage, fire, or any of the destruction that would be expected from an aircraft accident. The landing gear was properly positioned, all control surfaces remained properly aligned, engine cowlings showed no impact damage, and the cockpit appeared ready for immediate use. Someone had clearly taken extraordinary care to preserve the aircraft in perfect condition, treating it more like a museum display than abandoned military equipment. Initial examination revealed that the aircraft had not crashed at this location, but had been deliberately landed and stored in the underground facility with meticulous attention to preservation. All fluid systems had been properly drained and preserved, exposed metal surfaces had been treated with protective coatings, and the entire aircraft had been positioned and maintained as if it might be needed for future use. The preservation effort had been so successful that the aircraft appeared capable of returning to flight status with minimal restoration work. The discovery raised immediate and profound questions about how the aircraft had reached the underground facility and why it had been hidden there for 8 decades without any record of its location in official files. The hangar's access tunnels appeared too small for the Hellcat to have entered in its current assembled configuration, suggesting either that the aircraft had been completely disassembled and reconstructed underground, or that alternative access routes existed that the exploration team had not yet discovered. Either possibility indicated a level of planning and resource commitment that far exceeded anything associated with routine military operations. Examination of the aircraft's interior revealed additional mysteries that deepened rather than resolved questions about Sullivan's fate. His personal flight gear, including his leather jacket, helmet, and personal effects, remained in the cockpit exactly as he would have left it. They were carefully arranged as if he had just stepped away from the aircraft temporarily rather than disappearing forever. His flight log was still clipped to the instrument panel, with entries showing normal mission progress up to the point where he had transmitted his final radio message to base control. Nothing in the cockpit suggested emergency conditions, mechanical problems, or any of the circumstances that might have forced an unplanned landing in the remote mountains. All instruments were properly configured, fuel gauges showed adequate reserves for completing the assigned mission, and there were no indications of equipment malfunctions. The aircraft appeared to have been deliberately flown to this location rather than forced down by emergency circumstances. The underground facility contained extensive documentation that began to illuminate the mystery of Sullivan's disappearance and reveal the true nature of his final mission. File cabinets throughout the complex were filled with operational orders, technical manuals, personnel records, and correspondence that revealed the installation had been constructed as part of a highly classified program code named Project Redwood. The program's stated purpose was to test experimental aircraft and evaluate captured enemy technology in complete secrecy, using facilities that could operate without any connection to normal military channels. According to the discovered documents, Project Redwood had been established in early 1944 under the joint sponsorship of the Navy, Army Air Forces, and the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, representing an unprecedented level of inter-service cooperation for such a highly classified program. The underground facility had been constructed using advanced engineering techniques and specialized labor, provided by carefully selected personnel who had been sworn to absolute secrecy about their work. The project's goal was to reverse engineer captured German technology while maintaining complete operational security about American efforts to develop advanced aircraft and propulsion systems. Sullivan's role in Project Redwood had been far more significant than the routine reconnaissance mission described in his official orders. According to the personnel files, he had been specifically recruited for the program based on his exceptional flying skills, engineering background, and proven reliability under combat conditions. His assignment involved conducting test flights of experimental aircraft and providing detailed pilot reports on their performance characteristics, capabilities, and potential military applications. The camera equipment he had carried during his final mission had actually been sophisticated instrumentation for measuring aircraft performance parameters rather than standard photographic equipment for surveillance purposes. The documents revealed that Sullivan's final flight had been a test mission involving experimental propulsion systems that had been reverse-engineered from captured German technology. including jet engines and rocket-powered systems that were years ahead of publicly acknowledged American capabilities. His Hellcat had been extensively modified with additional instrumentation to evaluate the performance of experimental aircraft that were being tested simultaneously from the underground facility. The mission had proceeded normally until Sullivan observed one of the experimental aircraft suffering catastrophic mechanical failure that resulted in the death of its test pilot and the destruction of irreplaceable prototype equipment. Faced with the loss of critical technology and the exposure risk posed by potential wreckage discovery by civilian authorities, project commanders had made the decision to order Sullivan to land at the underground facility rather than return to base as originally planned. His radio silence during the final portion of the flight had been intentional, designed to prevent any official record of the facility's location or the experimental aircraft programs being conducted there. The decision to conceal Sullivan's fate had been made at the highest levels of government, justified by the project's critical importance to national security and the need to protect German technology from potential Soviet acquisition. The facility's records contained extensive documentation of Sullivan's activities after his unexpected recruitment into Project Redwood, revealing that rather than being killed or imprisoned, as some theories had suggested, he had been offered the opportunity to continue serving as a test pilot for the most advanced aircraft development program in American military history. The offer included immediate promotion, substantially increased compensation, and the promise that his contribution to national security would eventually be recognized once the project's existence could be safely revealed to the public after the war's conclusion. Sullivan had accepted the assignment after considerable personal struggle, understanding that his decision meant effectively disappearing from his previous life, and allowing his family to believe that he had died in service to his country. Personal letters found among his effects revealed the emotional difficulty of this decision, and his hope that the war's end would allow him to return to normal life and be reunited with Catherine and his family in Iowa. He had continued working as a test pilot for Project Redwood, including their subsequent assignments after the program's termination and their ultimate fates in civilian or continued military careers. The final entries in Sullivan's personal diary, discovered in his quarters within the underground facility, delivered a grim, long-concealed truth. He had died in a flying accident during the spring of 1946 while testing an experimental aircraft based on German rocket technology that proved lethally unstable. His death occurred during the same precise period when Project Redwood was being formally dismantled, and its personnel were being either reassigned or discharged under comprehensive secrecy pacts. The highly specific timing of his demise suggested a troubling possibility that Sullivan's death might not have been entirely accidental, but rather part of a calculated effort to eliminate witnesses possessing detailed critical knowledge about highly classified technology programs being transferred to other government agencies. The discovery of Sullivan's pristine aircraft and the Project Redwood facility represented one of the most significant archaeological finds in modern American military history, providing unprecedented insight into the secret weapons development programs that shaped the early Cold War and influenced American technological capabilities for decades. The underground installation yielded technology, documents, and artifacts that revolutionized understanding of American efforts to acquire and exploit German scientific advances during the final years of World War II and the immediate post-war period. However, the discovery instantly posed immediate and significant challenges for the urban exploration team. The facility contained classified technology and documents that remained protected under national security laws despite their age. The explorers faced potential prosecution for unauthorized access to classified materials, while government agencies scrambled frantically to determine how to respond to the exposure of a program that had remained officially secret for 8 decades, and whose very existence had never been acknowledged publicly. The comprehensive analysis phase of the Project Redwood discovery began immediately after the urban exploration team documented their initial findings and reported them through appropriate channels. The complexity of the situation demanded unprecedented coordination between multiple government agencies, academic institutions, historical preservation organizations, and security agencies responsible for protecting information that might remain sensitive. The initial response came from the Department of Defense's Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, which deployed a specialized team to secure the site and conduct a preliminary assessment of the discovered materials. This expert response team included military historians specializing in Wwii technology, engineers familiar with captured German jet and rocket propulsion, intelligence analysts versed in classification protocols, and security personnel tasked with protecting any sources or methods potentially still in use. The meticulous aircraft preservation effort was led by Smithsonian Institution specialists working alongside Navy historians, Grumman engineering representatives, and independent vintage aircraft restoration experts. Sullivan's Hellcat was found in remarkably sound condition, requiring only minor restoration work to return it to a state fit for display or potentially even flight. The specialized camera and instrumentation equipment installed for Sullivan's final mission provided valuable insight into 1940s technology development and highlighted the sophisticated nature of Project Redwood's research objectives. Document analysis teams worked systematically through the enormous volume of materials in the facility's filing systems, gradually revealing that the scope and significance of Project Redwood far exceeded initial estimates. The program had involved hundreds of personnel working across multiple facilities, with research activities that extended well beyond simple reverse engineering of captured German technology. It included original American innovations that built upon German research to create prototype aircraft and propulsion systems that would not be matched by publicly acknowledged programs for many years. The personnel files provided detailed information about everyone involved in Project Redwood, including their subsequent assignments after the program's termination and their ultimate fates. Many participants had been transferred to other classified programs that became the foundation for early NASA activities, advanced weapons development projects, and aerospace industry research efforts that continued through the Cold War period and beyond. Several key figures had gone on to prominent careers in aerospace and government service, maintaining the strict secrecy required of them throughout their professional lives. Sullivan's personal effects and diary entries provided intimate details about daily life inside the classified program and revealed the psychological challenges faced by personnel who had been completely cut off from normal society for security reasons. His writings revealed the constant stress of maintaining absolute secrecy about work that he believed was crucial to national security, while simultaneously dealing with profound guilt about allowing his family to believe he was dead. The diary entries painted a detailed portrait of dedication mixed with personal sacrifice that characterized many participants in classified programs during the transition from wartime to Cold War operations. Technical analysis of the experimental aircraft technology found throughout the facility revealed sophisticated engineering achievements that had been decades ahead of publicly acknowledged American capabilities during the 1940s. Rocket propulsion systems, advanced aerodynamic control mechanisms, and metallurgical innovations discovered in the facility provided concrete evidence that American technological capabilities in the late 1940s had been far more advanced than previously known by historians or the general public. Some of the technology discovered remained classified because similar systems were still in use by contemporary military programs or had influenced the development of current aerospace capabilities. The medical facility within the underground installation contained extensive records of research conducted on the physiological effects of high-speed flight and rocket propulsion exposure that had been conducted on volunteer test pilots, including Sullivan and his colleagues. These studies had provided crucial data for developing life support systems and pilot protection equipment that were later used in subsequent aircraft development programs, space exploration efforts, and high-performance military aviation. The medical research had been conducted according to ethical standards that were appropriate for the time period, though some procedures would not meet contemporary requirements for informed consent and participant protection. Intelligence analysis focused on determining how German technology had been acquired and transported to the Project Redwood facility, revealing an extensive international network of operations designed to identify, capture, and exploit German research capabilities before they could fall into Soviet hands during the chaotic final months of the war in Europe. The program had involved close cooperation with British intelligence services, competition with similar Soviet efforts to acquire German technology and personnel, and coordination with Allied military forces advancing into German territory. The communications equipment found throughout the facility provided insights into the sophisticated security procedures that had been used to maintain Project Redwood's complete secrecy from normal military channels and civilian oversight. Encrypted communication systems, elaborate code procedures, and comprehensive operational security protocols revealed an understanding of intelligence protection that had been developed specifically for programs operating outside normal command structures. Some of the security innovations discovered in the facility had been adopted by other classified programs and had influenced the development of contemporary information protection systems still in use by intelligence agencies. Archaeological analysis of the facility's construction techniques revealed engineering methods and construction procedures that had been borrowed directly from German military engineering specialists who had been recruited to work on American projects after the war's conclusion. The underground excavation methods, concrete formulation techniques, and structural design principles showed clear influence from captured German technical manuals and consultation with German engineers. The construction quality and advanced techniques explained why the facility had remained structurally sound and habitable after 8 decades without any maintenance or inspection. Environmental analysis determined that the facility's underground location had provided ideal preservation conditions for maintaining aircraft equipment and documents in operational condition for extended periods. The stable temperature and humidity levels, combined with the sealed environment that had prevented oxidation and biological deterioration, explained why Sullivan's Hellcat and other sensitive equipment had survived in such remarkable condition. These natural preservation conditions, combined with the original preservation efforts undertaken by project personnel, had created a unique time capsule that preserved technology and information that would otherwise have been lost. Legal analysis teams worked to determine the contemporary classification status of the various materials found in the facility and to establish appropriate procedures for eventual public disclosure of information that no longer required protection. Many documents remained classified under current security regulations due to their connection to ongoing intelligence operations or their revelation of methods still in use by government agencies, while others had been automatically declassified by the passage of time or changes in technology that had made the information obsolete. The legal teams worked to identify materials that could be safely released to researchers and the public while ensuring continued protection of information that remained genuinely sensitive. International coordination efforts were required because some of the technology found in the facility had been acquired through cooperation with Allied intelligence services during World War II and the immediate post-war period. British, Canadian, and other Allied nation representatives were consulted to determine their interests in the discovery and to ensure that any public disclosure would not compromise continuing intelligence relationships or reveal methods still being used by Allied services for contemporary operations. The international consultations revealed that several Allied nations had conducted similar programs involving captured German technology, suggesting that Project Redwood had been part of a broader international effort to acquire German scientific advances. Media strategy development teams prepared comprehensive plans for managing the inevitable public interest in the discovery while protecting classified information that could not be revealed without compromising national security. The combination of a missing World War II pilot, secret underground facilities, and advanced technology promised to generate intense media attention that would require careful management. The media strategy balanced transparency with security requirements in ways that would allow meaningful public disclosure without compromising ongoing operations. Historical preservation specialists evaluated the facility for potential designation as a National Historic Site, while considering the complex security implications of allowing public access to areas containing classified technology and information. The underground installation represented a unique and irreplaceable example of World War II-era military architecture and contained artifacts from secret weapons development programs that had no equivalent in publicly accessible museums or historical sites. However, preserving the site required a careful balance between its educational and historical value and the continuing security concerns that prevented full public disclosure of its contents. The psychological evaluation team assessed the potential mental health implications for Sullivan's surviving family members, who would finally learn the truth about their relative's fate after 8 decades of uncertainty and unanswered questions. The revelation promised to provide closure about Sullivan's actual death, while potentially creating new emotional trauma related to the deception that had been maintained for so many years, and the knowledge that he had actually survived his supposed death date by nearly 2 years. Counseling services and support resources were arranged for family members who might need professional assistance in processing this long-delayed information about their loved one's fate. Scientific analysis of the experimental aircraft remains and prototype technology found throughout the facility provided valuable data about early jet and rocket technology development that had previously been known only through incomplete documentation and theoretical speculation. The physical artifacts allowed researchers to understand the actual capabilities that had been achieved by classified programs during the 1940s and to compare them with contemporary technology development efforts in other countries. Some findings required extensive classification review before they could be shared with academic researchers or incorporated into historical studies of aerospace development. The comprehensive analysis phase required nearly 2 years to complete, involving dozens of specialists from multiple organizations and requiring extensive coordination. The process revealed that Project Redwood had been far more significant than anyone had suspected, representing a crucial bridge between World War II technology acquisition efforts and Cold War weapons development programs that would shape American military capabilities for decades and influence the technological confrontation with the Soviet Union. The final analysis report confirmed that Lieutenant Commander James Robert Sullivan had indeed died in service to his country, though under circumstances that were far different from what his family had been told, and in ways that had contributed significantly to American national security during the crucial early years of the Cold War. His work as a test pilot had advanced American aircraft technology by years and had provided crucial capabilities that were later used in the confrontation with the Soviet Union. The discovery ensured that Sullivan's sacrifice would finally be recognized and remembered, even though the full story had remained hidden for 8 decades due to the extraordinary security requirements of the program in which he had served. The revelation of Sullivan's true fate and the discovery of Project Redwood represented a watershed moment in understanding American military history during the crucial transition from World War II to the Cold War, providing concrete evidence of classified programs that had only been speculation among historians. The underground facility and its contents demonstrated the extent to which American military and intelligence agencies had succeeded in acquiring and exploiting German technology, while maintaining security that had protected these achievements from both foreign adversaries and domestic oversight for 8 decades. The discovery also illustrated the profound personal costs of national security decisions that had required extraordinary personal sacrifice from ordinary individuals serving their country during times of international crisis. Sullivan's story represented thousands of similar cases where military personnel had been asked to disappear from their normal lives in service of classified programs that could never be publicly acknowledged, accepting personal sacrifice for the greater good of national security during the dangerous transition from World War to Cold War confrontation that had shaped the modern world.